Hey guys, tonight we are going to get incredibly, deliciously lost. Picture yourself holding a crinkly scroll that smells like old church pews and candle smoke. You open it with reverence, expecting clarity. Instead, you find wavy lines that pretend to be coastlines, whole oceans filled with monsters, and places you thought you knew now hidden behind Latin you cannot read and lions you very much hope are not real. Welcome to the world of medieval maps. These are not just old school GPS systems. They are windows into how people once saw the world. And wow, were they confused, creative, and occasionally correct. As you wander this parchment universe, you quickly learn that logic takes a back seat to belief, and navigation often leans more on hope than on compass readings. And yes, you probably will not survive this cartographic nightmare if you try to use it for actual directions. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it over there? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You unfold a map the size of a dinner table and immediately wish you hadn't. The British Isles are suspiciously circular. Africa looks like it melted in the sun. Asia stretches off the edge like a noodle. And the map labels? They are in black letter script so ornate it looks like the alphabet was trying to impress a king. But you have to remember, these maps were never meant to be accurate. At least not in the way we think about accuracy today. Instead, they were attempts to reflect a world shaped as much by scripture, hearsay, and imperial ambition as by coastlines and compass points. That twisty bit of Norway? Better throw a sea serpent in there. The jungles beyond India? Toss in a giant, dog-headed man who worships fire. You do not put those creatures in because you believe they are real. You put them there because they feel real when the edge of the map meets the edge of your imagination. Historians still argue whether these monsters were intended as literal warnings, religious metaphors, or just creative filler. Probably all three, depending on the map, the monk, and how late he stayed up drawing. Then there is the matter of what counts as a place. On a modern map, you expect cities, rivers, maybe a McDonald's or two. But on a medieval map, you might find the birthplace of Adam, or Mount Ararat, yes, the one from the Ark story, or a drawing of Alexander the Great building a wall to trap the apocalyptic hordes of Gog and Magog. And they are all given equal billing with Paris or Rome. You feel a chill, not because of the monsters, but because you realize something deeper. This map is not trying to tell you where to go. It is trying to tell you what matters, which explains why Jerusalem often sits at the center of these maps, no matter where you are in the world. The cartographers were not trying to confuse travelers. They were arranging the world according to divine order. A cosmic layout, not a practical one. A theological diagram disguised as a travel guide. Of course, some viewers might roll their eyes. How could they be so wrong? But think about it. We use subway maps every day that bend geography into spaghetti so the lines are easier to follow. We make weather maps that color code danger in bright red blobs. We look at election maps where a few pixels of farmland speak louder than entire cities. In a way, We are not so different from the people who thought dragons marked the edge of the world. And do not forget the materials. These maps were not just ink on paper. They were often painted on parchment scraped from animal hides. Vellum, to be precise. A single large map could take the skins of several calves. Imagine being a monk hunched over a curling sheet of vellum in a freezing scriptorium, trying to remember what Ethiopia is shaped like, while also working out how to draw a griffin with a quill the size of a pencil stub. The idea of north at the top was not yet standardized either. Some maps put east at the top because that was where the sun rose, and more importantly, where the Garden of Eden was believed to be, hence the term orientation, as in orienting a map comes from the Latin oriens, meaning east. Every time you orient yourself, you are subconsciously nodding toward Eden. Quirky, right? But also kind of beautiful, because these maps were less about utility and more about meaning. And that is what you start to see as you gaze deeper into the lines. A world drawn not with measurements, but with metaphors. Still, there is something oddly comforting in their messiness. These maps embrace the unknown. They do not pretend to have it all figured out. They gesture at mystery. They whisper, "We do not know, but we imagine." And maybe that is something we have lost with satellite precision and Google Street View. The permission to be wonderfully, gloriously uncertain. So you fold the map back up, carefully, reverently. You still do not know where you are, but somehow you feel a little more at home in the world. And that really is the point. You squint at the edge of the map again. That wriggly thing with too many fins. Is that a fish? A dragon? A very tired dolphin? The Latin scribble beside it does not help much. But the message is clear. You are not supposed to go there. Or if you do, good luck. This is where the monsters live. We often imagine medieval people as naive or gullible, but give them some credit. They were not just drawing sea serpents, because they had no idea what a whale looked like. They were drawing sea serpents, because they knew it would make you hesitate. Those creatures were narrative shorthand for danger zones, unexplored territories, or places where rumors far outpaced reality. Some monsters were lifted straight from classical texts. Others came from sailor gossip or merchant stories passed along dusty trade routes. And some were just made up, but all of them had a job to fill the gaps. You see, maps are inherently incomplete. No matter how accurate or up to date, they always leave something out. And in the Middle Ages, the gaps were enormous. Vast oceans, dark forests, and empires built more from hearsay than stone. So when there was no real data to draw from, cartographers turned to something much more reliable: fear. Fear is a fabulous filler, and so they filled the margins with cynocephaly. Those are the dog-headed people, Blemmy's torso people with faces in their chests, and dragons big enough to swallow ships whole. Some were drawn mid-chomp, just for emphasis. You stare into one dragon's inky eye, and it stares right back at you. You imagine the monk who inked it, eyelids drooping, fingers sore, maybe smiling as he gave the creature just a little more tail than necessary. Historians still argue whether these beasts were drawn with any belief in their literal existence. Some scholars suggest the monsters were symbolic, meant to convey chaos, sin, or the presence of the unknown. Others think certain creatures, like mermaids or sea bishops, were genuinely believed to exist thanks to misidentified marine life and the human brain's insistence on finding faces in everything. Take the sea bishop, for instance, a strange creature supposedly caught and presented to the King of Poland in the 1500s. It allegedly made the sign of the cross before escaping back into the ocean. Was it a hallucinated monkfish? A hoax? Or just someone with a bit too much communion wine? No one can say. But it found its way onto maps, just the same. And then there are the unicorns. Less ferocious, but just as fictional. In some maps, they show up prancing through forests, occasionally next to lions, because artists love a good visual contrast. Unicorns were associated with purity and Christ, and their appearance on a map was less zoological and more theological, which tells you something else important. Medieval maps were moral documents as much as they were navigational ones. You wander a bit farther across the parchment and find a lion mid-roar, not lurking in the Sahara. No, this one's prowling through what is supposed to be Central Europe. Lions were shorthand for the exotic and the wild, even when wildly misplaced. If you lived in the 1300s and had never traveled more than 20 miles from your village, a lion might be just as mystical as a phoenix. This was especially true at the edges, the literal and metaphorical edges of the known world. That is where the most dramatic creatures lived, not because they were believed to roam there, necessarily, but because that is where imagination roamed. You remember your childhood fear of the attic, the basement, the closet. The unknown is always most vivid in the shadows. Medieval maps put those shadows on parchment and then gave them teeth. But the monsters were not always scary. Some were oddly cute, others downright majestic. There is a certain joy in how lovingly some of them are rendered, great loops of scale, generous plumes of flame, tails that curl like ribbon candy. This was not lazy drawing. This was commitment. And speaking of commitment, some of those monsters were clearly editorial decisions. You look at one particularly crowded corner of the ocean and wonder how any ships could pass through without being eaten, cursed, or serenaded by singing mermaids. Which raises a question. Were mapmakers exaggerating to protect people or to sell parchment? Because yes, these maps were often status objects. Nobles hung them on walls. Princes showed them off. Merchants used them as proof they had access to the wide world, even if what they were pointing at was an imaginary island ruled by a one-eyed sorcerer. Cartography was prestige, and monsters were part of the pitch. Imagine walking into a chamber and unfurling a map so covered in dragons, krakens, and cockatrice clusters that your rival merchant gasps. You may not know exactly where Madagascar is, but you sure look like you do. And that illusion? That is power. There is one especially lovely example on the Carta Marina, a map created in the early 1500s by Olaus Magnus. It is filled with monsters, some battling ships, some battling each other. There is a sea cow, a narwhal-looking fellow labeled as a sea unicorn, and a horrible little guy eating a man's arm like it is a breadstick. This map is not only famous, it is enormous, nearly 5 by 4 feet, meant to be admired, not carried. And yet, it had real utility too. Some of its creature placements hinted at pirate routes or hazardous waters. In this way, the monsters became a strange form of data, coded warnings hidden beneath scale and foam. In other cases, the monsters served almost like branding. You could recognize a particular cartographer by how he drew his sea beasts. Were they sinuous and subtle? Probably a cautious monk. Were they flamboyant, all claws and fire? You were likely dealing with a secular artist trying to make a name for himself in noble circles. The maps became storytelling devices, and stories need villains. You trail your finger along one final dragon, its wings spread across half a continent, eyes full of secrets. You wonder who invented it, who decided where it should go, who thought, this part of the world is blank, let's fill it with fear. And somehow, that fear still flickers through the parchment centuries later. You slide your hand across the worn edge of the parchment, tracing the stiffened curl where some poor monk spilled wax, or maybe just sighed too hard after drawing his 8th consecutive eel-headed sea beast. This particular map, like many of its kind, features not only creatures and fantastical lands, but also some of the most unintentionally delightful calligraphy you have ever seen. It is not practical, legible, or remotely consistent, but it is gorgeous. You can almost hear the parchment whisper, "You are not meant to read this quickly," and that is the point. The writing on these maps, the elaborate black letter, the curling Gothic scripts, the occasional red rubric, was part of the aesthetic package. It was cartography dressed in cathedral robes. The lettering itself became a kind of decoration, winding around sea monsters, hugging coastlines, or perched like birds on mountain ridges. This was not your basic Arial font. This was a world that took its writing very seriously. Historians still argue whether the ornate scripts were intended to impress viewers, slow down readers for careful contemplation, or simply follow manuscript traditions that predated maps entirely. Likely, it was all three, because when you live in an age when most people cannot read, and ink is worth more than wine, every letter matters. Some maps were so heavy with stylized text that deciphering them today is like trying to decode a message from a particularly dramatic wedding invitation. But you can appreciate the flourish, the swoops, the sharp dagger tails of letters like G and Y, the spindly spires of capital M, and just like the monsters, the script helped fill an empty space. If you do not know what lies beyond the Pyrenees, why not drop in a beautifully inscribed warning about bandits, ghosts, or barbarous peoples with unspeakable customs? You spot one long label in crimson ink snaking along the coastline of somewhere vaguely Baltic. It translates roughly to, in this region, the sun does not set for 30 days, and the beasts walk as men. Is it true? Probably not, but it feels true when written in that font, with all its holy menace and poetic authority. It is worth noting that these maps were often created in religious contexts. Many were crafted by monks, men whose entire lives revolved around script, structure, and sanctity. They saw maps not just as tools, but as visual theologies. Every letter was part of that devotion. And if a dragon needed a caption by God, that caption would be calligraphic glory. You lean closer and notice something strange. Some of the letters shimmer oddly in the light. That is no accident. The ink used was often made from iron gall, a mixture of oak galls, iron salts, and a bit of wine or vinegar to bind it. It aged into a soft brown black, durable and solemn. And sometimes the scribes would highlight sections with gold leaf or vermilion, adding a flair of divine glamour to places like Babylon or Jerusalem. These were not "you are here" maps. They were not folded in a saddlebag or shoved in a traveler's boot. These were sacred documents meant to be displayed, studied, and whispered about, which is probably why so many of them contain writing that requires not just reading, but interpreting. Take the Mappa Mundi, literally, map of the world. The most famous of these is the Hereford Mappa Mundi, a circular, intricate masterpiece from around 1300, roughly the size of a large door. Its writing, a tangled forest of Latin, peppered with marginalia, theological commentary, and curious claims like, "Here live the pygmies who fight cranes." You run your eyes along its chaotic radius, which places east at the top, as we mentioned before, and Jerusalem dead center. It is less a geographic map than a spiritual diagram, blending history, myth, and biblical lore into one epic tapestry of ink. And the font, the font is one of the main characters. But there was another reason for the flamboyant lettering authority. Medieval maps often had to convince people that the world they depicted was not just accurate, it was important. Fancy lettering did what italics and underlining do for us today. It signaled emphasis, reverence, and sometimes warning. It also helped distract from the fact that much of the map might be speculative at best. After all, if you label something with enough flair, people are less likely to question whether it exists. And it was not just Latin. Some maps included Greek, Hebrew, and even Arabic terms, each added as a kind of scholarly flex, a multilingual badge of honor. If your map had 10 languages, it meant you had consulted 10 times more sources. Or more honestly, you had copied them from someone who did. You are beginning to sense a pattern here. Maps were often collaborative projects, copied from older maps, which had been copied from even older ones, with each layer adding new glosses, new animals, and more flamboyant fonts. Some of the errors became almost poetic in their consistency. Mountains grew taller over time. Islands split like cells. Cities moved 50 miles to the left because the monk ran out of space and said, close enough. And the more dramatic the script, the more confident it seemed. Even the placement of labels told stories. Oceans got swirling wave patterns, often drawn by apprentice monks stuck with a boring job. Borders were often just decorative bands. And rivers? Rivers were the cartographer's chance to play, wiggling ribbons across the map with names like Tigris, Euphrates, or something suspiciously misspelled because the inkwell froze halfway through. But do not mistake beauty for randomness. These maps were organized with precision, just not modern precision. They mapped meaning, hierarchy, holiness. The font style, size, and orientation all contributed to that invisible logic. A place written in large, embellished letters was important, even if it was fictional. A region scrawled sideways in tiny ink, either insignificant, dangerous, or simply squeezed in because someone forgot to leave room. By now, you are probably imagining one of these maps hung above a stone fireplace, candlelight flickering over the golden inks, the whole thing smelling faintly of incense and damp wool. You are not far off. These were showpieces. Even the lettering whispered status, learnedness, divinity. And yes, despite all the dragons, dogmen, and 10-line Latin phrases that no one alive today can translate fully, there is something astonishingly comforting about them. They are both sacred and silly, both misguided and glorious, because the world, according to a medieval map, is not a place to be measured. It is a place to be understood, emotionally, spiritually, and beautifully. You lean into the parchment now, breathing in that phantom mix of dust, vellum, and ink, like the air of a forgotten library. The more you study the map, the more it feels like a dreamscape. But it is not just monsters and loopy lettering that enchant you. There is something else buried in the parchment, something you would not expect. Time. Not time like a date in a corner. Time as a presence, everywhere and nowhere. Medieval maps did not just tell you where things were. They told you when they mattered. Unlike modern maps, which fix geography with chilling precision, these maps were living documents, blending ancient legend, biblical history, and recent gossip into one tangled, glorious knot. Time on these maps is flexible, layered, and occasionally absurd. You spot the Tower of Babel nestled comfortably next to a city that was not even built until 2 centuries later. King Arthur's name floats in the same zone as Roman ruins. Paradise? Still very much pinned to the eastern edge of the world, marked with rivers and palm trees. You blink and realize this is a world where past, present, and myth coexist. Historians still argue whether medieval cartographers even intended these maps to represent chronological accuracy. Many believe the purpose was devotional rather than directional, to present a universe shaped by moral events, not GPS coordinates. And if that meant Eden was a short walk from the Nile, so be it. One of the most fascinating examples of this temporal collage is how biblical events were mapped as if they had spatial reality. You might find Noah's Ark drifting near Armenia, or the Exodus trail traced through a stylized Middle East. The Garden of Eden often appears in the Upper East, flanked by flaming swords, neatly labeled rivers, and sometimes a rather judgmental sun. You run your fingers over these places and wonder how it must have felt to live in a world where geography and theology were siblings. To trace a map and not just ask how far, but how holy. That is the trick with medieval maps. They do not reflect the world as it was, but as it should be. Order replaces chaos. Symbolism replaces scale. The largest cities are not always the most populated. They are the most spiritually significant. That is why Jerusalem is so often placed in the center, like a holy bullseye, not because it is centrally located on earth, but because it is theological center stage. You think about how maps like these were read aloud, not analyzed, not cross-checked, but read like scripture. A monk or teacher would point to regions with a long stick and recite the events that happened there, not in kilometers, in epochs. Here, a saint walked barefoot. Here, Alexander the Great built a wall to keep out Gog and Magog. Here, time itself folded inward. This sense of layered time also explains the maps' strange indifference to contemporary events. Some maps produced in the middle of the Crusades show surprisingly little about actual battlefronts, but plenty about Saladin's alleged correspondence with mythical Eastern kings. Time is not linear here. It is thematic, which leads us to a rather charming detail. Some maps include people who were never real, drawn as if they absolutely were. Prester John, remember him? The mythical Christian king, supposedly ruling a paradise somewhere in Asia or Africa. For centuries, people searched for him. Entire expeditions were launched. Letters were forged in his name, and yes, maps were drawn to include his kingdom, complete with stylized palaces and peaceful lions. It did not matter that no one ever found him. It mattered that he fit the story. You pause on one corner of the map where an angel is blowing a trumpet over a wrinkled mountain range. There is no label, no explanation, but you know what it is. Judgment Day. Because yes, some medieval maps do not end with an ocean. They end with the end, as in the literal apocalypse. If your map tells a story, it needs a climax. And nothing says final destination like a flaming angel and a collapsing sky. Even travel routes, those rare parts of the map that connect places with actual roads or rivers, are bent to fit the narrative. They twist like vines, sometimes ignoring logic entirely. A straight road is not the medieval way. The world was not meant to be easy to navigate. It was meant to be understood through stories. You notice something else: the seasons. Some maps allude to the changing winds, the best months for sea travel, or even where snow never falls. Not in the modern meteorological sense, but as folklore. The land of eternal spring near Ethiopia, the cursed Arctic, where ships are said to vanish under waves of ice. These were not climate zones. These were climactic zones, narratively charged. And time does not only appear in what is shown, it appears in what is missing. Entire regions are left blank or vaguely described as unreachable, not because they were unknown, but because they did not yet belong in the story. To put something on the map was to include it in the human timeline. Leaving it off was a kind of liminal erasure. You start to appreciate that these maps were not simply representations of space. They were theological calendars disguised as geography. Every monster, every font flourish, every palm tree on the edge of the world was part of a larger cosmic structure. These maps were attempting to hold the entirety of existence in 2 dimensions, stretching from Genesis to Doomsday, from Eden to the Empire of Tartary, from Jesus to Julius Caesar, all in one dramatic sprawl of ink. Of course, this makes them wonderfully inaccurate by modern standards, but it also makes them honest in a strange way. They never claimed to show everything as it physically was. They showed what mattered, and in doing so, they told their readers what to believe about the world. You tilt the parchment just a bit and let your eyes follow a line that starts with Adam, loops through Egypt, swirls past Greece and lands quite casually in heaven. It is a map of the earth, but really, it is a map of meaning. And maybe, just maybe, that is a better kind of map to fall asleep to. Your eyes drift now to the sea, not the kind of sea with neat coastlines and predictable currents, but a turbulent, ink-dark expanse scattered with beasts that make you squint and mutter. Wait, is that a lion with fins? Yes. Yes, it is. And it is attacking a ship that looks more like a giant walnut than a boat. Welcome to the part of the map where the imagination really starts to stretch its fins and its fangs. You are entering the realm of medieval sea monsters. They were not put there by accident. They were not random doodles added by bored monks looking to liven up a margin, although, to be fair, monks did have a tendency to doodle. These creatures had meaning. They marked danger, mystery, and above all, limits. Because when you filled a map out to the edges, you needed to show why people did not sail further. And what better excuse than the real possibility of being eaten by a six-eyed serpent with the body of a crocodile and the manners of a shark? Historians still argue whether these beasts reflected sincere belief or symbolic fear. Were they taken literally by the cartographers and viewers? Or were they narrative shorthand for "do not go here unless you have a death wish"? Probably a bit of both. After all, if someone back then told you the ocean held a squid the size of a cathedral, would you argue? You hover over one infamous monster, the Aspidocalone. It looks like an island, flat, rocky, even with a couple of cute little trees. But it is not. It is a giant sea turtle that lures ships to land, only to dive and drown them once the crew lights a fire on its back. It is in medieval bestiaries, and, of course, on maps. Because who needs subtlety when you can have existential terror in turtle form? The Aspidocalone is more than a monster. It is a metaphor for pride, for misplaced trust, for being too eager to claim new territory without understanding the risks. And this was the beauty of the medieval map. It did not just warn you about what was out there, but what was inside you. Then there are the serpents, long ribbon things coiled around islands or ambushing tiny ships. You can almost hear the screams of the painted sailors, frozen in miniature agony. Some of these serpents are adaptations of Norse mythology, like the Midgard serpent that encircles the world. Others seem purely invented, built from hearsay and dramatic instincts. A sailor once said he saw a snake off the coast of Norway, draws enormous death noodle, but it is not all teeth and terror. Some creatures are almost adorable. There are sea cows, yes, literal cows with flippers, floating calmly in the waves. There are fish that look like they are smiling. There are whales with castles growing from their backs, which suggests either a long swim or a very confused architect. And then you spot mermaids. Oh yes, mermaids were a fixture of medieval cartography. Not always beautiful, not always friendly, but always intriguing. They sit on rocks combing their hair, holding mirrors, occasionally dragging sailors to their doom. Some maps show them simply watching the horizon, as if they know the future, but are not terribly impressed by it. You wonder, did people really believe in these creatures? The truth is, belief in the medieval world was not binary. You could accept that mermaids existed without needing to prove it. Their presence on the map said less about zoology and more about the kind of world this was. A world rich with mystery, where knowledge had borders, and beyond those borders, the unknown could take any shape. Many of these sea creatures came directly from bestiaries, compilations of animals, both real and imagined, used to teach moral lessons. A whale might symbolize gluttony. A siren might warn against lust. A kraken might remind you that some things are bigger and angrier than you can imagine. When these creatures migrated onto maps, they carried their symbolism with them, and placement mattered. The further from Europe you went, the weirder the monsters got. Northern seas had walrus-like beasts with tusks longer than your arm. African coasts featured serpents, dog-headed fish, and the occasional fish-headed dog, which may or may not have been a monk with a flair for exaggeration. The edge of the known world, that was where the real nightmares lived. But not all these monsters were enemies. Some were obstacles, some were lessons, and some were challenges. A dare to go further, to be braver, to discover what lay beyond even the most ridiculous of doodles. There is a famous phrase, whispered across centuries of map geekdom: "Here be dragons." Except, plot twist, it is not found as often as people think. The Latin phrase, hic sunt dracones, only appears once that we know of, on the Hunt Lennox globe from around 1510. But the sentiment is everywhere. Creatures were used in place of facts. When you did not know what was there, you filled it with awe, or horror, or hope. One quirky detail: some maps labeled monstrous areas not with beasts, but with cryptic phrases like "inhospitable waters" or "no one returns from this coast." It is like medieval cartographers invented the horror movie tagline. They thought it was just a fishing trip, and the monsters were not limited to sea. Sometimes they crept inland too, usually in the margins, where normal geography broke down. You might see manticores lounging near desert kingdoms, or unicorns sipping from rivers outside India. That is because maps followed not just lines of land and sea, but lines of thought. If a certain place was mysterious, foreign, or the subject of questionable traveler tales, it became fair game for fantasy. Take the stories of Pliny the Elder, that wonderfully eccentric Roman naturalist whose work influenced mapmakers for centuries. He claimed that in distant lands, people had no heads but faces on their chests, or feet so large they used them as umbrellas. Ridiculous? Absolutely. But also on the map. Because the map was not a contract. It was a conversation between knowledge and wonder, between what we know, what we fear, and what we desperately want to find. And maybe, if you squint at these sea monsters long enough, if you imagine the waves moving, the sails snapping, the crew shouting as they lean over the edge, you realize something. The monsters were not there to scare you away. They were there to mark the edge of safety, the beginning of adventure. So yes, the lionfish hybrid is weird, and the turtle island is deeply unfair. But somewhere, just past their reach, is the part of the world no one has mapped yet, and that is where the real story begins. Now you let your gaze fall on something quieter, but no less powerful. Not the monsters, not the mermaids, not even the confused-looking lions wandering around Asia. You look at the words, not the place names necessarily, though those are delightful in their own right, riddled with unpredictable Latin spellings and guesses about how to spell Africa when you have never been closer than Sicily. No, what really pulls you in is how those words are written. The font. Oh yes, we are going to talk about medieval map fonts, because believe it or not, those curling, elegantly spaced letters were not just decorative flourishes. They were loaded with purpose, power, and occasionally a surprising amount of sass. You trace your finger over a single capital letter. It is enormous, curvy, almost theatrical. It probably took an hour to draw. It stands taller than most buildings illustrated on the map. And that is the point. Font, in medieval maps, was as much about drama as it was about clarity. If the script shouted, it meant this place matters. Historians still argue whether cartographers chose their lettering styles purely for aesthetics, or if it reflected deeper hierarchies of information. Was Gothic script used for holy cities because it looked more sacred, or rounder letters chosen for oceans because they mimicked waves? These are debates that swirl through academic circles, like fancy calligraphy ink in water. But to understand why the fonts look the way they do, you need to know what medieval writing even meant. Back then, writing was physical labor. It was a spiritual act, a kind of craftsmanship fused with prayer. Monks, often the primary creators of both manuscripts and early maps, spent years perfecting their letter forms. Each stroke of the pen was part meditation, part technical execution. There was no Times New Roman, no Helvetica. There was only what your hand, your training, and your God allowed you to create. So when that care translated to maps, the result was fonts that did more than inform. They enchanted. Take Lombardic capitals, those chunky, decorative capital letters with thick stems and whimsical curls. These were not just used for emphasis. They were used to elevate. The city name written in a Lombardic capital was being crowned. And if it was Jerusalem, well, you better believe the ink was darker, the lines more deliberate, the sense of reverence practically humming off the page. Then there's black letter, or Gothic script. It is what you probably picture when you imagine medieval writing: dense, angular, and slightly intimidating, like it wants to whisper secrets about plagues and sword duels. This script appears across many medieval maps, especially in areas meant to communicate seriousness. Think borders, think royal domains, think warnings. But some scripts were playful. You will find unseal and half unseal, round, looping styles that look like they were doodled by a saint who had recently discovered cursive. These often show up near less formal annotations, notes about fishing villages, or little blurbs explaining why a certain island is inhabited by dog-headed men. Because obviously, someone had to write that down legibly. And then there is the hierarchy of size. Bigger letters for continents, medium for regions, tiny, fussy script for details you might never notice unless you had a magnifying glass and a lot of curiosity. The fonts themselves become a hierarchy of importance, whispered in ink. You run your eyes across the script for the Atlantic Ocean. It stretches elegantly, almost lazily, like it knows it has room to breathe. Meanwhile, cramped text fills the Mediterranean, every city squeezed into the margins, as if Europe was gossiping in a crowded marketplace. The shapes of the letters also change depending on the purpose of the map. Mappamundi, those religiously influenced world maps made by monks, leaned heavily into illuminated script, the kind with gold leaf, the kind that looks like it belongs in a storybook whispered in candlelight. But portolan charts? Those were for sailors. No frills, clean lettering, functional. No one wants calligraphy when you're being tossed around the Adriatic and trying to find a harbor. In these maps, function led form. But even then, the lines were crisp, the geometry precise. Even utility had style. And now for a fun fringe fact. Some maps had singing fonts, or rather, musical notation was embedded into the script. Yes, certain medieval cartographic manuscripts included verses or psalms written in melodic script, intended to be read aloud musically. Imagine singing your way across the coast of Iberia. The idea was not just to orient your body, but your spirit. You smile, because honestly, how many Google Maps directions have ever come with a chant? And then there are the little touches, ligatures where two letters melt into one, exaggerated ascenders, those tall, elegant strokes that rise above the rest, or drop caps the size of a walnut. Some letters have faces, some curl into dragons, some look like they are dancing. It is typography as theater. But perhaps the most comforting thing about these fonts is how handmade they are. They wobble, they lean, they carry the tension of the wrist that drew them. A little too much pressure here, a shaky flourish there. The font is not sterile, it is human, and that humanness matters. It reminds you that every word on the map was shaped by someone hunched over a desk, likely in a cold monastery, working by candlelight. Someone who believed that writing a place name could be an act of reverence, that how you spell something could reflect how you feel about it. One last detail before you drift forward. Look closely at the names of unknown regions. Sometimes they are rendered in inverted Latin, a kind of mirrored script that looks beautiful but is nearly unreadable unless you already know what it says. Why? Because those places were seen as hidden, sacred, or simply not meant for easy access. It was the mapmaker's way of saying, "You are not ready for this place. Not yet, and maybe you are not." But that is what these fonts do. They lure you in. They whisper. They decorate the edge of knowledge with grace, with mystery, and with just enough clarity to make you want to turn the page, or, in this case, roll out the parchment a little further. You are now leaning over a particularly strange corner of the map, not because of the monsters, not even because of the font, but because this part of the map is upside down. Or is it? See, in the medieval world, north was not always up. In fact, more often than not, east was at the top. You are looking at a map that reorients your whole sense of direction. The landmass you thought was Europe is hanging sideways like a dripping candle. Africa stretches upward like a spear. Jerusalem, front and center, sitting at the spiritual crossroads of everything. Welcome to the mind of a medieval cartographer, where geography was only part of the story, and theology called the shots. This disorientation is not a mistake, it is deeply intentional. Medieval maps were not meant to be navigational tools in the modern sense. They were teaching devices, visual sermons, worldviews wrapped in parchment. If that meant turning the earth sideways or flipping it entirely, well, gravity was not the priority. God was. And that is why you are now staring at a perfectly circular world, often bordered by a thick red or gold ring. These are teal maps, named for their iconic design. A T inside an O. The circle represents the known world, and the T divides it into 3 continents: Asia on top, Europe bottom left, Africa bottom right with the Mediterranean as the vertical bar, and the Don and Nile rivers forming the crossbar. It is geography simplified for spiritual clarity. And yes, at the top east is Eden. Historians still argue whether mapmakers literally believed Eden could be found geographically, or if this placement was a symbolic gesture. Either way, medieval maps often place the garden at the edge of Asia, sometimes with 4 rivers flowing out of it, as described in Genesis. Sometimes Eden is walled off, sometimes shrouded in mist, but always just out of reach. You can imagine a curious merchant staring at the eastern edge and wondering if he could walk there. He will not survive the trip. But sure, go ahead. Pack some dried figs and a psalter. Then you notice something else. The world looks oddly squashed. Italy is a sad triangle. Scandinavia is just a vague lump. Spain and France bleed into each other like a water-stained painting. But this was not ignorance. It was prioritization. Mapmakers were not trying to be accurate. They were trying to be meaningful. What mattered was importance, not size. Jerusalem was big because it mattered. The Holy Land was central because it had to be. Distance could be bent, borders stretched, seas compressed, all in service of a narrative. These maps told stories, moral, biblical, imperial stories. Think less Google Earth, more illustrated homily with dragons. And these distortions get even more extreme when you look at pilgrimage maps, specialized diagrams made for people journeying to sacred sites. In these, roads become straight lines, cities become equally spaced dots, and rivers snake like subway tracks. It is not about terrain. It is about the experience of getting there. The bumps, the trials, the sense of progression toward something divine. There is one famous example, the Ebstorf map, that stretched over 12 feet in diameter before it was destroyed in World War II. It placed Christ's body over the entire world, his head in the east, his hands to the sides, his feet at the bottom, the entire earth laid over the body of Jesus. No GPS app will ever match that level of theological commitment. And this reminds you, many of these maps were not made by sailors or traders. They were made by monks. Their geography came from scripture, from Roman writers like Pliny and Ptolemy, and from travelers whose first-hand reports were often optimistic, let us say. So yes, if a friar named Godric claimed to have seen a land where men had faces in their chests, that land got a spot. Accuracy was filtered through authority, and authority was often cloaked in robes. Still, some cartographers tried to correct the record. You see small scribbles. This region is misdrawn, or based on hearsay, but those are rare. Most medieval maps are unabashed in their confidence. They show the world as a divine diagram, with human geography laid neatly over cosmic intention. One quirky side note: in some maps, the sun rises in the east, but also sort of spirals. Some medieval thinkers imagined a sun that curved over the sky like a divine frisbee, because again, physical laws were less pressing than spiritual metaphor. The sky moved because God wanted it to. And speaking of the sky, some maps even included stars, or zodiac symbols, drawn faintly in the margins, or placed above certain cities. It was believed that celestial forces shaped earthly events, so a map could become not just a landscape, but a horoscope, a way of reading not just where you were, but what fate might await you. Let that sink in. You are looking at a map that shows not only where Eden lies and what monsters await off the coast, but also what stars might influence your journey. Geography meets prophecy, all in the same parchment. But perhaps the most magical twist in all this reorientation is how these maps feel. You do not read them so much as absorb them. You do not navigate with them. You meditate. Each map is a universe, and you are not just a traveler on the road. You are a soul tracing your place in creation. So when you find yourself confused by the fact that everything seems tilted, warped, or spinning in a weird direction, remember, it is not the map that is upside down. It is you. You are still staring at that map, but now your eyes drift outward, not to what is on the map, but to what is just outside it, the edge. And this is where things get deliciously weird. You notice that beyond the continents, beyond the strange creatures, and even beyond the compass roses and delicate scrollwork, there is something else entirely: liminal space. The outer rim of the known world is not just a border, it is a threshold. And for many medieval cartographers, what lay beyond that line was, well, everything not meant to be known. That is where the phrase "here be dragons" comes in. Except, spoiler, it is almost never actually written that way. Historians still argue whether any medieval maps really used that exact phrase. Only one surviving example, from the early 1500s, has anything close. The Latin "hic sunt draconis" appears on the Hunt Lennox globe. But the idea? Oh, it is everywhere. You see it in the snarling sea beasts with eyes like full moons. You see it in the men with dog heads drawn loping across the east. You see it in the eerie blank patches labeled Terra Incognita, land unknown. And sometimes, even more unsettlingly, you see nothing at all, blank space. Now, blank space on a medieval map is not just laziness. It is intentional. It is a whispered admission. We do not know what is here. And depending on the cartographer's mood, that space could be ominous, or reverent, or both. Some maps framed that void with decorative borders, scrolls, floral patterns, angelic figures, as if to say, the map stops, but the story continues. Other times, the edge bleeds off into inked blackness, the medieval version of a cinematic fade out. You pause on one particular map, a circular mappamundi, and notice how it feels claustrophobic in the center, but liberating at the edges. Like the known world is a cage, and the unknown is freedom or doom, depending on your appetite for risk. But let us talk about the real celebrities of these margins. The monsters. They are not random. Each has a place, a role, a message. You see giant scaly serpents off the coast of India, a six-headed hydra in the Atlantic, a bird so big it can lift elephants. These were not just scare tactics. They were warnings, symbols of the limits of human mastery. The sea was not conquered. The lands beyond were not yours to claim. Yet, these illustrations also served a political and religious function. They told you, the viewer, here is where your faith ends and fear begins. And that is powerful. It is also surprisingly artistic. The artistry of these monsters is no joke. You have dragons with spiral tails that double as design motifs. You have fish with cathedral spires for fins. You even have humanoid creatures with their faces and their chests blemmies, or feet so large they shade themselves with them cyapods. These were drawn with care, sometimes with actual affection. You get the feeling that the cartographers enjoyed imagining the horrors they had never seen. And here comes your quirky tidbit. Some map makers would borrow monsters from older sources, like Roman naturalists, and just drop them in, no questions asked, no proof needed, like a medieval version of copy-pasting from Wikipedia. They figured if it sounded good in the natural history of Pliny, it was good enough for a map in 1305. But not all the weirdness was drawn. Some was written. Margins often contain bizarre little notes, tiny letters spelling out things like this region is scorched and uninhabitable, or here dwell the Antipodes, people who walk upside down. That last one, based on a genuine philosophical question. If the earth is round, are there people on the bottom? And if so, why don't they fall off? People ask that. The Antipodes, along with countless other margin dwellers, became stand-ins for what medieval Europe imagined as the other. Unfamiliar, foreign, possibly magical, probably dangerous, occasionally very hairy. This was not just fear of the unknown, it was fascination with it. And that brings you to a different kind of map edge, the theological one. Some maps featured an outer border not filled with monsters, but with angels, wings spread, trumpets raised, eyes unblinking. These were not geographic markers, they were cosmic ones, a reminder that beyond the world lay the divine, heaven, judgment. The edges of earth were, in a very real way, the threshold to eternity. And then there is the rarest of all outer markings, the hand of God. Yes, some maps show just a hand, emerging from a cloud, index finger pointing, sometimes blessing, sometimes just there, a kind of divine punctuation mark, a way of saying, the map ends here, but God does not. You stare at one such hand now. It is delicate, quiet, almost humorous in its placement, as if God is photobombing the world. But the message is clear. This is as far as you can draw. The rest is mine. The more you stare, the more you realize that the edge of the map was never really about what was out there. It was about what was in here, inside the medieval imagination. The margin was a canvas for fear, curiosity, humor, and hope. It was where cartographers played, speculated, and sometimes confessed. It was less of an ending and more of an invitation. Go find out, if you dare. One last thought before you move on. Some medieval maps were designed to be incomplete on purpose, like a book missing its final chapter, because the story of the world they believed was not finished. You, dear viewer, were supposed to write the rest, explore the rest, or at least imagine it, which is why, to this day, there is something hauntingly beautiful about those old map edges. They remind you that every known thing was once unknown, that the dragons were not failures of knowledge, but signs that someone, somewhere, knew there was more. You shift your attention now to something you might have been subconsciously admiring all along without even realizing it. The lettering, not the monsters, not the oceans or saints or scary marginalia, but the script itself. Yes, tonight, we are giving fonts the attention they deserve. You might not expect it, but one of the most surprising features of medieval maps, especially the large, lovingly illustrated Mappi Mundi, is just how beautifully written they are. Smooth, looping letters, elegant serifs, gorgeously inked Latin labels, curling like ivy around continents and coastlines. These were not haphazard scrawls. These were typographic love letters to the world. And here is the twist. Many medieval maps were made not by explorers or merchants, but by scribes, men trained in script before geography. So the writing did not accompany the map, it defined it. You glide your finger gently, in your imagination, over the graceful calligraphy spelling out Mare Oceanum in thick black letter. The sea looks wild, sure, but the letters? They are stable, confident. A beautifully written word, grounding a swirling ink sea. And the style was not one size fits all. There were different scripts for different purposes. For titles, you might get uncial, a bold, rounded script used for headings. It is wide-eyed, dramatic, and loves a flourish. For the body text, city names, mountain ranges, rivers, you would likely find Caroline minuscule or one of its later Gothic descendants. These scripts evolved over centuries, from the clean Roman styles promoted by Charlemagne to the dark, dense textura quadrata of later medieval manuscripts, which you may recognize from illuminated Bibles, and yes, even the opening crawl of certain fantasy movies. Historians still argue whether certain maps were primarily meant to be read or meant to be viewed. Was it about decoding place names? Or was the visual impact of those letters themselves the point? One thing is clear. Calligraphy was not a decoration. It was a worldview. The way you named something shaped how people imagined it. Nowhere is this clearer than in the labeling of mythical regions. Take Scythia. You have seen it several times now, sprawled across the unknown north, always in tall, sharp letters, like frozen icicles across the edge of the map. Or India, which often appears elongated, snaking along the edge of Asia in delicately inked gold letters, surrounded by spices, serpents, and men riding giant birds. The text invites the fantasy. And do not forget the sacred places. Jerusalem, centered like the sun in a geocentric solar system, is often written in the grandest hand of all, sometimes boxed in a cartouche, often in red or shimmering ink, and always in perfect symmetry. This was not just labeling. This was reverence through script. Here comes your quirky tidbit. Some maps actually used multiple scripts in one document. One style for oceans, another for land, another for annotations, like a medieval typographer's dream. And when the map was done, if the scribe had space, or if the patron paid extra, they might even add glosses in the margins, little written notes giving backstories to the monsters, local saints, or prophetic events tied to a region. You squint at one now, in faded ink. It says something like, "Here Alexander the Great did chain the beasts beneath the mountain, and there they sleep until the end of days." No coordinates, no legend, just that. It reads like a bedtime myth, and it probably was. But do not assume these were always precise. Medieval spelling was gloriously inconsistent. A city might be spelled 3 different ways on the same map. Latin was dominant, but regional flavors crept in. French, German, English, all influencing how a place name was written. And without standardized spelling, cartographers just made judgment calls. If they heard a name third hand from a Flemish monk who had once met a Genoese sailor who had heard of a village in Africa, well, congratulations, it made the map, spelled phonetically, creatively, and confidently wrong. Yet somehow, the script lends it credibility. You look at those elegant curves and think, well, it must be true. Just look at that G. And let us not overlook something very modern feeling about all this. The maps were designed thoughtfully, artfully, and with intense attention to detail. Spacing was deliberate. Contrast was managed. Negative space was respected. Lettering flowed with the coastline like vines around a trellis. If anything, these maps were closer to infographics than raw data charts. You begin to notice visual rhythms, alternating line weights, parallel text orientations, even a rudimentary kind of kerning. You have probably never felt compelled to compliment the kerning of a medieval map before, but here we are. And then, as your eyes scan one final, illuminated scroll, you notice something that makes you pause. Single name. Your name. Or rather, the name of your hometown, written oddly, spelled a little off, but definitely there. The idea that someone, centuries ago, hand-lettered the name of your little corner of the world with care and ink and centuries of dust between you. It makes you feel strangely present, like you are part of the map, even now. Because that is what this section is really about. It is not just about fonts. It is about recognition. Maps like these did not just chart land, they charted meaning. The act of labeling a place, of choosing its name, its size, its font, was a way of saying, this matters. And if your town made it onto the parchment, that meant something. And even if it did not, well, that just meant you still had dragons to chase. You lean in now, blinking a little more slowly, still drowsily mesmerized by those gorgeous maps. But something starts to shift. Less dragons, less monsters, fewer dog-headed men galloping across the margins. A new style emerges, something more clinical. You're entering the Renaissance. The cartographic world is about to get shaken like a snow globe. Until now, maps have mostly been spiritual, artistic, and speculative. You remember all those saints, beasts, and margin notes about doomsday prophecies? Yeah, those are about to be steamrolled by math, astronomy, and a little device called the printing press. Suddenly, maps have to do something they never had to do before: be accurate. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance marked a clean break from medieval mapmaking or more of a slow evolution. Either way, you can feel the change as soon as you lay eyes on a 15th century portolan chart. No monsters, no Eden, just coastlines, real ones, dotted with compass roses, each line more angular, more navigational, more useful. You are no longer looking at a symbolic world centered on Jerusalem. You are looking at something meant to help ships not crash into rocks. And it is kind of a buzzkill. Not completely. There is still beauty. In fact, portolan charts are stunning in their own right. They sprawl like spider webs, covered in fine ink lines connecting every port in the known Mediterranean with obsessive precision. The ink is crisp, the parchment stretched thin, and the names are written perpendicular to the shorelines, like soldiers standing guard along every coast. You imagine a sailor, calloused and sunburned, rolling this map out over a barrel on a creaking ship deck. There is no room for unicorns here, just wind, stars, and prayer. But even that sailor, practical as he is, would still recognize that these maps came from the same lineage as those fantastical mappamundi. The impulse is the same, to make sense of the chaos. And just like that, the age of exploration barrels in. The Americas, new sea routes to Asia, entire continents burst into European consciousness. And mapmakers? Oh, they are giddy. This is when names start appearing that no medieval scribe would recognize. Florida, Brazil, Nova Scotia, Java Major. Places that were once blank voids now become scribbled in with urgent ink. New coastlines look like squiggly guesses, and honestly, they are. But it does not matter. The idea of a map being constantly updated becomes the new standard. But here is the surprising thing. Despite all this progress, you still see dragons. Really. Renaissance maps, even maps made after Columbus's voyage, still feature mermaids luring ships and sea monsters writhing off Newfoundland. Not because people still believed in them, though some definitely did, but because the imagery had become traditional, decorative. You know, like how nobody today actually believes in Cupid, but he still shows up every Valentine's Day shooting heart-shaped arrows at your dignity. So yes, fantasy lingers. And here comes your quirky tidbit. Some Renaissance maps began to include explanations for their monsters. Tiny texts that say things like, "This beast is drawn here not because it has been seen, but because it is said to be dangerous to ships," like little legal disclaimers. The map equivalent of may contain traces of nuts. Still, the shift is clear. By the late 1500s, you start seeing fewer bestiaries and more biographies. The age of the map artist is giving way to the map scientist. People like Mercator, yes, that Mercator, start building globes and projections that distort the truth in mathematically useful ways. Remember how the medieval world was often drawn as a circle with Jerusalem in the middle? Well, now Europe wants to be the center. Literally, the center of maps, the center of trade, the center of what civilized means. Cartography becomes politics, and power, and empire. And that brings us to an awkward truth. Maps are not neutral. They never were. But during the Renaissance, they become instruments of colonization, a way to draw lines around places no European had ever stepped foot in, and say, "This is ours." Entire regions in Africa and the Americas are drawn based on rumors and hope. Mountains are invented. Rivers are exaggerated. And still, those lines hold. And maybe, as you look back at those old maps full of dog-headed men and sea lions, you realize something unexpected. They were more honest, because they did not pretend to know. They filled in gaps with fantasy, sure, but they admitted they were guessing. These Renaissance maps, they guess too, but they do it with a straight face. That brings you to a curious moment on a 1570 map by Ortelius. It is one of the first true Alices. Beautiful, detailed, and in the margins, guess what? You still find decorative cartouches, little panels with allegorical figures, wind gods puffing their cheeks, personifications of continents, complete with symbolic flora, fauna, and fashion. Europe is a queen, of course. Africa is half-clad and holding a scorpion. America is barefoot and feathered. These images were not just aesthetic. They were ideological. They told you what to believe about places you had never seen. That some were noble, others savage, all available. And the lettering? Still exquisite. So while dragons are on the decline, there is something darker replacing them. Certainty. The kind that flattens the world into resources and borders. The kind that tells you there is nothing left to wonder about, only things left to own. But even in that certainty, a spark of curiosity remains. In the blank spaces, in the strange place names, in the decorative compass roses that serve no navigational purpose at all. Because deep down, mapmakers never stopped being artists. They just started wearing lab coats. And as you roll up this imaginary Renaissance scroll, you realize something very human. Even when we claim to know everything, we cannot help but leave room for mystery. Now you are drifting into deeper waters, the forgotten corners of the page where the parchment wrinkles, the ink smudges slightly, and the maps start whispering things that never made it into official history. You are entering the world of marginia, the doodles, inscriptions, and oddities left in the blank spaces of medieval and early Renaissance maps. Some were deliberate, some were mistakes, some are just weird. You squint at the corner of one particularly tattered 14th century mappamundi. The official map ends well before the parchment does. Yet there, in the bottom left corner, is a tiny figure, a man. He has one enormous foot raised over his head, like an umbrella. You blink. It is not a joke. That is the Cyapod, a one-footed mythical creature said to live in the tropics, who used his gigantic foot as sunshade. You are not making this up. Medieval monks certainly were not. At least, they hoped they were not. Marginia like this tells you something essential. Even maps had humor. That little cyapod? He is not in the main geography. He is in the leftovers, the margin, the spot where the scribe ran out of coastlines and monsters and said, "You know what? I'm just going to draw that guy with the umbrella foot." Boom, done. These margins were playgrounds, creative outlets, and sometimes little emotional vents. Think of the monk who spent 3 years copying texts and drawing mountains only to scribble in the corner, "I am so tired." That actually happened more than once. Maps were no different. In the margins, you find not just creatures, but cryptic symbols, Latin puns, personal jokes between scribes, and commentary that never made it into the main legend. You might even find early versions of inside jokes, like a compass rose labeled "Good Luck, Sailor," or a volcano labeled "Definitely Not Cursed Probably." Quirky tidbit? Some mapmakers drew themselves in the margins. Tiny, robed, hunched over figures at desks, tucked next to Greenland or peeking out from behind the Caspian Sea. It is like medieval Where's Waldo, but with more ink blots. And some of these marginia are quietly profound. Take the Hereford Mappamundi, one of the largest surviving medieval world maps. In one of its outer zones, near the edge of the known world, a small Latin phrase reads something like, "Beyond here, there is only the sea." It is written small, almost like a whisper, not because they feared the ocean, but because they feared not knowing. Historians still argue whether such marginal notes were official annotations or personal scribal additions. Were they trying to add information? Or were they simply muttering to themselves in ink? You can imagine the monk who wrote that, brushing crumbs from his lap, squinting at the lantern light, and thinking, what even is out there? And perhaps the most fascinating thing about marginia is how modern it feels. You recognize this instinct. You have scribbled in your notebooks, doodled in the corners of things, written LOL in the margins of a printout. You, too, have made the edges your playground. And here you are, in the company of a 13th century friar who probably did the same, except with a quill. The best part? Sometimes these marginal scribbles outlasted the official content. Texts fade, political borders change, rivers dry up. But that weird two-headed chicken doodled beside India? Still there, still judging you. Now, let us not pretend that all marginia were light-hearted. Some maps carry notes that are darker, more superstitious. A line like, "Here, men eat their own children," appears beside a region completely unknown to Europeans. Is it true? Of course not. But it was fear given form. And the margin was the safest place to exhale that fear without admitting ignorance in the main text. You trace your eyes across a border and find one more whisper. The sea is full of voices. That one is from a 15th century Venetian map. No coordinates, no elaboration. Just that, a poet's truth, quietly placed beside the practicalities of ports and wind. And then there is the matter of corrections. You find, in some maps, tiny scratched-out cities, or place names written twice with conflicting spelling. In one especially chaotic example, a scribe has written Africa 3 times on the same continent, once in elegant script, once in all capitals and once upside down. Either the map was reused, or the scribe was over-caffeinated on fermented fig juice. Hard to say. The point is, maps were living things, and their margins were their nervous systems, where twitchy, spontaneous thoughts appeared, passed between creators, and sometimes made it to you. And here is a lovely modern echo of that. In many libraries, the marginia on ancient maps are studied with as much excitement as the maps themselves, because they are human, personal, often unfiltered. You picture a modern historian bent over a high-resolution scan, ignoring the neatly labeled Red Sea, and instead fixating on the little blob beside it with the word, maybe Atlantis, scribbled in shaky hand. Now that is a treasure. And that brings you to one last whisper from the margin, a phrase barely visible, ink faded by centuries. But if you squint just right, it says, "I was here." And somehow, that is the most powerful line on the whole map. Because whether you are a sailor, a monk, a historian, or just someone trying to fall asleep tonight, that is all you are really doing, leaving little traces in the margins. Scribbles that say, "I thought about this. I wondered. I imagined." And that makes you a cartographer, too. You are sailing now toward the edges of the world. No, not the literal edges, but the conceptual ones. Tonight, you are going to trace your finger across a special kind of phrase that litters medieval and Renaissance maps. You have probably heard it before. It shows up in memes, movies, even tattoos. 3 words: "Here be dragons," or in Latin, "Hic sunt dracones." It has got that perfect mix of mystery and menace, does it not? The idea that cartographers just shrugged and filled in the blanks with fire-breathing reptiles. But here is your first big surprise tonight. Almost no historical maps actually say that. Seriously, historians still argue whether the phrase "here be dragons" ever appeared more than once on a real map. That map is the Hunt Lennox globe from around 1510, where the Latin version does seem to be scrawled near Southeast Asia. And even then, it is small, easy to miss. Definitely not flaming across the whole Pacific like Hollywood would have you believe. So how did this legend grow so large? It probably started with misunderstanding and good storytelling. Early maps did often label unknown regions with cryptic phrases, things like "unknown lands," "here are wild men," or "the always classy land of cannibals." Throw in a few illustrations of monsters and boom, people assume they must have written dragons there too. And to be fair, mapmakers were into monsters. You remember those snarling fish beasts with the lion heads and wings? Yeah, they were not always labeled, just drawn there, staring blankly at the ship, trying not to sink. Sometimes there would be a note: "This creature devours entire vessels." Very comforting. But most of the time, they just floated out there unaccompanied, like the world's worst Tinder profiles. This brings us to your quirky tidbit of the evening. There is an actual 16th century map that says, in Latin, "Here be elephants," and in another spot, "Here be lions," but no dragons. Sorry, the branding department really missed a trick. Still, the spirit of the phrase holds up. It encapsulates the medieval mindset perfectly. If you do not know what is there, It is probably terrifying. You see, fear of the unknown was not a flaw in medieval cartography. It was its organizing principle. Every monster was not just a fantasy. It was a placeholder, a symbol for the outer edge of human understanding. Past this line, chaos. Imagine it like this. You are in the scriptorium, bent over your parchment, drawing Africa's western coast based on a sailor's muddy story and 3 different guesses. Eventually, your knowledge runs out. The coast curls away into the mist, and your hand hovers above the page. You do not know what is beyond that. So, maybe slap a serpent there, just in case. It is equal parts speculation and self-preservation. But here is where things get fun. Those imaginary dangers, they told you what kind of stories people were telling at the time. In some maps, the seas are filled with krakens and mermen, suggesting a fear of stormy oceans and the unknown depths. In others, the land is crawling with headless men, reflecting anxieties about foreignness and human deformity. In other words, monsters were like mood boards for an entire civilization. And when you really dig in, you start noticing that the most frightening parts of the map are also often the most beautifully decorated. Look at the Carta Marina by Olaus Magnus, an incredible 16th century map of the north. The sea monsters are everywhere. Giant lobsters clawing ships in half, sea serpents winding through fjords, a literal sea cow floating mournfully near Iceland. But instead of hiding these creatures in the margins, Magnus spotlights them. They are large, centered, and shaded with loving care. It is like a field guide to existential terror. Now, this is where things twist a bit. Some scholars believe that monsters were not warnings at all, but invitations. Strange, right? The idea goes like this. Instead of saying, "Do not go here," some map makers may have been saying, "Look what you might find." Because as dangerous as sea serpents are, they are also really cool. They fire up the imagination. They dare the viewer to venture further. And in a world where exploration was becoming big business, mystery could be profitable. So which is it? Fear or fascination? Maybe both. That duality is what makes these maps so intoxicating. They are not just guides. They are expressions of a mindset. They let you peer inside the head of a 14th century monk or a 16th century merchant and see what they thought the world could be. Not what it was, what it might be. And that brings us back to you. You are lying there now, tucked under your blanket, surrounded by your own unknowns. Maybe you are wondering what your future holds. Maybe the world feels like a map, with half its pages blank, and the rest scrawled in languages you do not speak. It is okay. You are allowed to put a dragon there. Seriously, there is something oddly comforting about admitting that you do not have all the answers, that parts of your personal map are filled in with guesses and hopes and little hand-drawn monsters, because someday you will fill those gaps, or someone else will, and they will look back at your scribbles and smile. One last thing to remember, even the most monster-ridden medieval map always had a way through. A dotted line, a windrose, a slender route between jaws. Because even in the age of dragons, people kept exploring. They never stopped drawing forward, and neither will you. Now you are tracing not monsters, but something subtler, something that winds through these ancient maps not with teeth or claws, but with ink and rhythm. You are noticing the lettering. Go ahead, really look at it. The names of rivers curve like snakes, slithering downstream in tight little italics. Kingdoms bloom in florid, looping capitals. The seas ripple not just with waves, but with words, each letter spaced like pearls, floating gently along imaginary tides. You are looking at a surprisingly gorgeous piece of medieval mapmaking, the calligraphy. Yes, tonight you are venturing into the surprisingly stylish world of cartographic handwriting, that elegant, sometimes eerie, always meticulous font that gave every map its signature voice. And here's the part that gets you. The letter forms were not just meant to label places. They were designed to feel like them. You are sailing across the Mare Tenebrosum, and the letters themselves stretch like seaweed. You drift past Scythia, and the S curls just like the serpents drawn beside it. You see, in medieval cartography, typography was not an afterthought. It was part of the atmosphere. Let us start with the basics. Map makers, especially in monastic scriptoria, trained extensively in lettering before they ever traced coastlines. In fact, the same monks who copied the Bible were often the ones who penned these maps, which means you, stretched out now under your blanket, are admiring the calligraphy of someone who probably copied Genesis 50 times before he ever wrote the word Persia. You are not just reading. You are looking at muscle memory, discipline, and aesthetic ambition inked into skin-thin vellum. Now here is your mainstream historical fact. The black letter style, also known as Gothic script, dominated European maps between the 12th and 16th centuries. Those tall, dense, angular letters, the ones that look like they are wearing chainmail, that is black letter. It was both fashionable and functional. It fit more text in less space, perfect for cluttered little maps full of creatures and coastlines. But not all maps looked the same. In Italy and Spain, cartographers leaned toward more open, Roman-inspired scripts, legible, classical, a little smug about their clarity. Meanwhile, maps from Northern Europe often went heavy on the Gothic, thick strokes, spiky serifs, and that mysterious, slightly haunted air you only get when someone writes the word Arabia like it belongs on a tombstone. Here comes your quirky tidbit. On some maps, cartographers deliberately mismatched their fonts. Yep, they used one type of lettering for the known world and another for the unknown. Italy might be neatly labeled in elegant humanist script, while Africa is scrawled in an eerie hand with jagged lines and uneven spacing, as if to say, this part we kind of understand. That part? Who even knows? And sometimes, the letters lie. You trace your eyes along a graceful word, Taprobana, which looks like it belongs to a shimmering, regal city. In reality, it was a mistake, an ancient confusion between Sri Lanka and Sumatra, twisted by time and repeated beautifully for centuries. Historians still argue whether mapmakers really believed in these misnamed places, or whether they were just copying earlier maps to impress patrons. Either way, the fonts helped sell the fiction. You cannot doubt a land when it is written in such confident, swooping lines. Let us talk now about how the font feels, because it absolutely does. You glance at Hibernia, and the word has a soft, curving grace like rolling hills. Tartaria, by contrast, arrives in sharp peaks, jagged like mountain ranges. Ethiopia spreads wide and sun-baked across a tan vellum desert, the letters spaced so far apart they might be dying of thirst. These fonts were not passive. They spoke. They whispered tone, mood, attitude. They could scream danger or hum mystery. Some even teased the viewer. In one late 15th century map, the phrase unknown land is written in a shaky, erratic hand, as if the scribe was actually scared while writing it. Maybe he was, or maybe he just had a sense of humor. And here is another delightful mystery for you to roll around in your half-sleeping head. Who exactly designed these letter forms? Most cartographers did not invent their own fonts. They mimicked what was fashionable in scriptoria or printed books. But every once in a while, a scribe would slip in a flourish, an extra long tail on a Q, a double-looped L, a little spiral at the end of a G. These were signatures in disguise, little ego moments, a way of saying, I was here, and I made this beautiful. One more detail, ink color. You notice that oceans are often labeled in red. Why? Maybe to stand out against the blue-green watercolor washes. Or maybe because red ink was expensive and dangerous looking and made the sea feel just a little more cursed. Now imagine you are holding the map up close, nose to parchment, and you see a smudge, a tiny place name, half blotted, smeared by some monk's hand 500 years ago. That blur? That is your connection to them, a human error in an inhumanly careful world. And when printing came along and maps were mass-produced, the fonts changed again. Suddenly, you get copperplate, cursive italics, and neat serif letters that look almost sterile, efficient, beautiful, yes, but lacking the quirk of hand-pen script. You start to miss the flawed stuff, the wobbly capitals, the uneven kerning, the places where Danemark is squeezed between a sea monster's tail and a decorative border because the scribe ran out of room, but kept going anyway, because that is what you do too. You write your life in a slightly wobbly hand, squeezing words into margins, doodling dreams into empty corners, trying to make it all look elegant even when it feels chaotic. Your life, in a way, is a map, and the font you use, it says more about your journey than the labels ever could. So next time you see an old map, do not just look at what it says. Look how it says it. Because someone, centuries ago, chose every curve and line of that letter. They dipped a quill. They breathed. They pressed ink to skin. And in that moment, they believed that even the unknown could be made beautiful. So can yours. You are floating now, deeper still into the parchment seas, where the margins begin to hum. You are no longer focused on monsters or lettering, but on what lies between them, the flourishes, the ornaments, the unexpected flourishes that serve no clear purpose, and yet seem absolutely essential. Tonight, you are going to explore the strangest visual element on medieval maps, the decorations that did not chart geography or danger, but beauty. the flourishes that transformed maps from tools into artifacts. And before you sigh and assume it is just vines and doodles, stay with me. These are not just decorations. These are statements. Some are bold political gestures. Some are quiet symbols. And some are, frankly, unexplainable. Let us start with a compass rose. There it is, nestled in the middle of the sea, all elegant spikes and swirling arms, pointing in 16 directions, and usually topped with a fleur-de-lis. You see one, and you know, this map is meant to move. The compass rose was not just navigational, it was decorative theater, often painted in gold leaf or intricate colors. It said, "This is no scribble on a scroll. This is a masterpiece." And then you notice the wind heads. Yes, wind heads. You probably spotted them already without realizing what they were. Those little puff-cheeked faces in the map's corners, blowing gusts across the oceans. Sometimes they are cherubs, sometimes old men with serious beards, sometimes, disturbingly, both. These are not just cute filler. They represent the directional winds. Boreas from the north, Eurus from the east, Notus from the south, Zephyrus from the west. A visual weather forecast, if you like, but stylized into myth. Now for your mainstream historical fact. Wind heads became especially popular in the 14th and 15th centuries, especially on portolan charts used by Mediterranean sailors. They gave maps personality and implied movement, making even static parchment feel alive. And in a way, they honored ancient Greek traditions of wind gods, something medieval mapmakers often snuck into their otherwise Christian imagery. But that is not all the decorating they did. Look closer. You will find coats of arms floating in the middle of oceans, flags planted on cities like cartoon markers, whole royal families lounging in thrones drawn onto continents they never visited. These illustrations were not accidents. They were a way to stake a claim. You see, maps were not always about truth. They were often about power. That brings us to our quirky tidbit. In a 15th century Catalan atlas, there's a full-color illustration of the king of Mali, Mansa Musa, calmly holding a massive golden orb while smiling at the viewer. Why? Because word had reached Europe that this African king was rich beyond imagination, and the mapmaker wanted to show it. It is the cartographic version of putting a celebrity on a magazine cover. That image, by the way, is one of the most iconic in medieval cartography. And yet, no one knew what Mansa Musa actually looked like. The figure is entirely fictional. Decorative, yes, but also narrative. It tells a story, even if that story is mostly guesswork and gold paint. Now, about those mythical creatures, one more time. This time not in the water, but on land. Some maps have forests filled with unicorns, deserts swarming with scorpions the size of donkeys, entire regions labeled with phrases like, "Here dwell the dog-headed men," and around them, decorative borders that look like pages from illuminated manuscripts, which makes sense when you think about it. Historians still argue whether medieval maps were ever really meant for navigation, or if they were more symbolic, like a picture Bible for the world, a way to understand, not just get around. And when understanding is the goal, beauty matters. Let us pause now and admire the border work. Yes, the frames. Some maps were wrapped in intricate bands of interlace, those Celtic-style knots that twist forever. Others had floral borders, almost garden-like, blooming outward from Greenland to India. Some even had textual borders, like poems or prayers tracing the edges. One famous map ends with a Latin verse blessing the reader's journey, and another curses those who dare copy it. Quite the range. But the most mesmerizing decoration of all? Empty space. Yes, blankness. You stare at a corner of the map that is just open. Maybe a pale wash of blue. Maybe soft tan parchment. No labels. No beasts. Just silence. That emptiness? It is not laziness. It is design. That space gives your eyes a rest, your mind a place to wander. It reminds you that the world, even on a map, is still partially unknown. And here is a small mystery to ponder as you drift into the edges of your thoughts. Some maps show ghostly outlines of coastlines, just faint hints, like the mapmakers started to draw them and then stopped. Were they guesses? Visions? Warnings? We may never know. But they add to the atmosphere, the layered feeling that you are not just holding a diagram, but a dream, one inked in style as much as substance. So tonight, as you trace the decorative borders with your mind, consider this. A map does not have to tell you everything. Sometimes it just has to invite you in. It can be part theater, part gospel, part gallery wall, a place where fact and fiction swirl together, wrapped in vines and wind faces and dignified lines. And maybe that is the greatest decoration of all, the invitation to wonder, because here, on this map, drawn in brushstrokes and fantasy, you are allowed to not know. You are allowed to admire the art without understanding every part. You are allowed to let your imagination do the traveling. You are drifting now toward the map's edge, not the edge of the parchment, necessarily, but the edge of what can be known, the place beyond which the lines vanish and imagination takes over. The part labeled not with kingdoms or coastlines, but with silence. Or maybe, if the cartographer was feeling theatrical, a polite little phrase like, "Hic sunt dracones." Yes, here be dragons. You have heard that phrase before, right? Used to suggest danger, mystery, or at least a spicy bit of storytelling. But tonight, as your eyelids get heavier and the weight of the world grows distant, you are going to learn what it really meant and what it didn't. Because here's the twist. Most medieval maps did not actually say, "Here be dragons." That phrase appears only once, literally once, in the entire historical record of European cartography. It was scribbled in Latin on the 16th century Hunt Lennox globe, where the South Asian coast is marked HCSVNT Draconis. That is it. One map. Not exactly a trend. So why do we think they all said it? Maybe because the maps felt like they should have. When you look at a medieval map, especially a mappamundi, you are not just looking at geography. You are looking at worldview, faith, fear, imperialism, curiosity, myth. And in that world, the unknown was not a blank space. It was alive. You are staring now into the outer corners of a map, where the real and the unreal dance. There is a griffin on a hill, its claws larger than the city it perches above. There is a giant antelope next to India Superior, shown grazing peacefully beside a man with a dog's head. There are men with faces in their chests, cyclopes, lemii, troglodytes. These beings did not spring fully from fantasy. Many were inspired by travelers' tales, filtered, exaggerated, and mistranslated over centuries. Pliny the Elder, Herodotus, Marco Polo, they all left footprints across medieval cartography, but their words were interpreted through medieval eyes. And those eyes? They saw strangeness not as impossibility, but as divine mystery. That brings us to our mainstream historical fact. Most medieval maps were not built for sailors or soldiers. They were theological tools, ways of visualizing the divine order of things, which is why Jerusalem is often smack in the center, and why east is at the top, not north. Think of that. Orientation comes from orient, meaning east. You literally orient a map by turning toward paradise. That is how deep the symbolism goes. But while the center showed the sacred, the margins showed the wild. And here comes your quirky tidbit. One famous map, the 13th century Hereford Mappamundi, features a panel that describes the Antipodes, people who supposedly lived on the underside of the earth with feet pointing the other way. It notes, politely, that their existence was debated. After all, how would they ever meet us? Would they fall off the world? Did they even wear hats? Historians still argue whether medieval scholars truly believed in such beings, or used them as metaphors for spiritual otherness. What matters is this: the creatures were placed deliberately, with care, in zones marked as liminal, not real, but not nonsense either. A kind of narrative scaffolding for everything that could not be verified. You, curled up now and nearly dreaming, understand this instinct better than most. You too have filled your own unknowns with symbols, maybe not manticores or sirens, but metaphors all the same. Your fears, your hopes, your what ifs, they all live at the edges. That is why medieval maps are so comforting. They do not pretend to know everything. They admit their gaps, but they fill those gaps with style, with dragons and wonders and improbable beauty. Now consider this final image. You are standing at the end of the world, map in hand, just like a medieval traveler. Behind you lies the known. Ahead, uncertainty. Do you turn back, or do you walk forward anyway, trusting that even the strangest beasts might teach you something? Because sometimes the dragon is not a threat. It is a signpost, a way of saying, here is where the adventure begins, and that, in the end, might be the quiet truth behind all those fantastical margins. Not fear, not ignorance, but invitation. Come see what else might be out there. Because even now, with satellite imaging and GPS and AI-generated topography, you still do not know everything. The world remains full of strange corners. And you? You are still mapping yourself as you go. So let the dragons keep their watch at the edges. Let the mermaids sing to the passing ships. Let the compass rose spin. You are safe in your bed, warmed by blankets, gently lulled by the hum of your fan. But in your mind, you are still exploring. And that dear listener, is the most medieval thing about you. So now, let us close the atlas gently. Let the parchment quiet under your hands, the ink cool and dry. The monsters tuck themselves back into the margins where they belong. Your journey tonight has carried you across oceans and legends, past cities real and imagined, through mountains made of script and seas filled with calligraphy. You have met creatures born of misunderstanding and wonder, and you have followed the lines drawn by people who believed, even in uncertainty, that beauty was worth the effort. Let that belief carry you now into sleep. Let your thoughts soften like vellum warmed by candlelight. Let your heart beat slow, like the quiet rustle of turning pages. There are no dragons here now, only stillness, only you, and the hum and the steady drift of your breath. You have traveled a long way through ink and myth, font and flourish, and you have returned richer, even if you cannot name exactly what you have learned. That is what the best maps do. They do not just guide, they stay with you. Their corners curl into your dreams. So rest now, cartographer of the mind. The monsters will wait until morning. The wind heads have stopped blowing. The compass rose has stilled, and the map, it folds itself away like a lullaby. Good night.